The arrival. Red Rock Station, Montana Territory. 1883. The wind came down the valley like a whip, dry, merciless, stinging with dust and the aftertaste of winter. The train screeched once, exhaled a final plume of smoke, and lumbered away from the Red Rock Station, leaving behind a hush as heavy as snow. From that hush emerged a figure, unsteady, rail-thin, her shadow too light for the weight she seemed to carry. She staggered once on the steps, then again, and before anyone could speak or act, she collapsed face first onto the cracked wooden platform, her limbs folding like someone long past exhaustion. Her dress torn and dirt-streaked flared at the hem where the wind caught it. One boot was missing its sole, the other was scuffed to ruin. Her lip was split clean through, and one eye had swollen nearly shut, angry. And purple the skin stretched taut around it. Her body trembled in short, sharp bursts, as if it hadn't yet decided whether to give in or keep going. It wasn't just the bruises or the dried blood that made the station master flinch. It was the look in her eyes, wide, hollow, fixed on something long behind her. She looked like a woman who had run from hell and hadn't yet realized she'd made it out. "Mom," he ventured, stepping forward, voice low and unsure. But she didn't answer, didn't move. Her knees buckled all at once, like her spine had forgotten how to hold itself upright. And then, without sound or resistance, she crumpled into the wood, dust rising up around her like smoke from a dying fire. The cowboy who stepped in. Yates O'Conor. It was the cowboy who moved first. Yates O'Conor had been leaning against the fence rail, boots crossed at the ankle, hat tilted just low enough to keep the sun off his eyes. He wasn't watching the train so much as waiting on a delayed shipment of fence wire, or maybe just letting the day pass slow. But the second she fell, he saw, 2 strides long and sure, and he was beside her before anyone else had shifted from their spot. He dropped to his knees with the calmness of a man who had faced panic before and knew how to tame it. His arms slid under her without hesitation, one beneath her back, the other curling behind her knees. She felt weightless in his hold, like she'd already let go of the world. Her head slumped against his chest, her skin cold beneath layers of dirt and sweat, but she was breathing. Shallow, uncertain, but breathing. That was enough. "Where's the doctor?" Yates barked at the station master, his voice low but clipped with urgency. "Town's 4 miles out," the man stammered, eyes wide. "Closest dock is out there. I'll take her," Yates said, already turning toward his buckskin mare. He didn't ask permission, didn't wait for a second opinion. He cradled her with care, like something precious and broken, and settled her gently onto the saddle, holding her close in front of him as he swung up behind. The mare took off at a hard trot, dust kicking from her heels as they disappeared down the trail toward town. The ride to town. A flicker of trust. She was barely conscious during the ride, her body swaying with each motion of the horse. Her head rested against Yates' collarbone, and once or twice she stirred. Once her eyes fluttered open, confusion swimming behind them. His arm shifted slightly to adjust her balance, and in response she flinched so violently that it nearly unseated them both. He held tighter but gently. "Easy," he murmured, not looking down at her. "You're safe now." She blinked up at him, her eyes rimmed with red, clouded with fear and disbelief. For a heartbeat it looked as if she might speak, but she didn't. Her gaze drifted somewhere far off, and then her eyelids dropped again, sealing her away in whatever half-dream had kept her alive this long. They reached Dr. Keller's clinic by dusk. The old man stepped out onto the porch, squinting at the pair riding in. He took one look at her limp, bloodied fading, and without a word, held the door open. "Lay her down on the cot," he said, voice thick with age and concern. "I'll get what I need." Yates carried her inside, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, and stepped back as the doctor went to work. But he didn't leave. He stayed by the door, arms crossed, jaw set like iron. She would live. The doctor said so hours later. But she needed food, sleep, time. And though no one asked him to, Yates stayed the night on a wooden chair by her bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her breath. He didn't know why. Not yet. Only that something about the way she had collapsed without a cry, that quiet surrender, had rooted itself deep in his chest. He would not leave her alone again. First light, her awakening. She woke with a kind of stillness that comes after pain. Not gone, but paused. Light filtered through the old curtains, slanting in pale gold across the rough planked floor. The scent of antiseptic hung faintly in the air, mingled with the earthy scent of boiled tea. Calla's throat burned when she swallowed, and her limbs ached like they had been torn apart and stitched back with memory. Alone. The first thing she saw was the man in the chair. Yates sat as he had for hours, his boots planted, firm arms crossed over his chest. In his hands, a tin mug of steaming tea. His hat sat beside him on the floor, and in the morning quiet, he looked almost as if he belonged to the room, like a still part of the walls, or a shadow waiting on purpose. She tensed without meaning to. He saw it immediately. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was soft but sure, like a man who meant every word, even if he didn't speak many. "You fainted at the station. I brought you here." Her eyes flicked to the door, then the window. Escape routes? She was measuring them like breath. Her lips didn't move, but the calculations were written in every tightened muscle. "My name's Yates," he offered after a moment. "Yates O'Conor. I run a cattle outfit west of here." She said nothing. "You got a name?" There was silence again, long and uncertain. Then she looked down at her hands, at the bruises that ringed her wrists like cuffs, and finally rasped, "Calla." "Calla what?" Her voice cracked again. "Zane." He nodded slow, like he was cataloguing the name in a place that mattered. "You hungry, Calla Zane?" For a moment she didn't answer. Then her eyes filled just slightly, and she nodded once. "Then let's get you fed. Steady as the mountains." The days passed, not fast, but steady. The kind of days that didn't ask anything except to be survived. Calla barely spoke, and when she did, her voice was the sound of something broken, learning how to move again. She ate slowly, deliberately, every bite like a test of whether she was still allowed to live. She didn't let the doctor near her anymore. Not after that first night. Only Yates. Only the quiet cowboy with the slow eyes and the calloused hands, who never tried to touch her unless necessary, and never looked at her like she was something ruined. He came by each morning with food hot, simple filling. He didn't ask questions, didn't press her. He just sat nearby while she sipped broth from a tin cup or chewed dry bread in silence. He brought books once. Apples another time. Sometimes nothing at all except the weight of his presence, solid and dependable. She began to look forward to the sound of his boots on the porch. On the third morning, she said it barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Yates glanced at her eyes, narrowing like he hadn't expected to hear anything from her mouth that day. "You don't owe me anything," he said. She looked away. I didn't think anyone would help me." He didn't respond right away, and she was grateful for that. Gratitude was a heavy thing when it came wrapped in shame. But he didn't dismiss her words either. He just let them hang there between them like something sacred and fragile. The bruises were fading now, pale yellow where they'd once been purple. Her cheeks had color again, and for the first time she sat upright without leaning against anything. But it was on the 5th day that the wall cracked and everything spilled out. The children. She lost it happened like a lightning strike, sudden, unprepared for. She had been eating a bowl of beans quiet as usual when her spoon stopped mid-air. "I had 2 children," she said. The words landed like stones on the floor between them. Yates looked up, his face still, his body motionless as a fence post in wind. "Willa and Weston," she continued. "They're 5 and 7. Her voice was distant, as if telling someone else's story. "A man took them, said I wasn't fit, said I had nothing and he had everything, money named friends." Her hands trembled now, though she didn't seem to notice. "He used to be my husband. He beat me until I couldn't see straight. Then he told the court I was unstable." She set the bowl aside untouched. "I tried to take them back. I tried to run. He found me before the train. I barely made it out." Her voice cracked. She blinked hard. "I don't even know where they are now." Yates's jaw worked once. He clenched his fists and let them rest again, carefully. "Did you tell the sheriff?" She shook her head. "He has money. Friends in court. They don't believe women like me." Yates stared at her a long moment. "You're not alone anymore, Calla." She blinked fast, disoriented by his certainty. "Why do you care?" He walked slowly to the window and said, "Because I saw the way you dropped at that station, like you'd carried the whole world on your back. No one should have to live like that." She sat quiet for a long, long time. Then, with a breath that sounded like the breaking of something invisible, she said, "I don't want to hide anymore." He turned. "Then don't." Her chin trembled. "What if he finds me again?" "Let him try. A room above the feed store." Time softened its grip after that day. Calla didn't return to her old self because there was no old self to return to, but she began to inhabit her body again. To speak without flinching, to move without apology. She took a small room above the feed store offered by Mr. Halston in exchange for sweeping dusting and keeping the front windows clean. It was modest, a Carter basin, a view of the alley, but it was hers. Yates came by often, though he never assumed. He'd tap twice at the back steps, wait for her to say yes. Sometimes he brought apples from a neighboring farm. Sometimes a newspaper or a second-hand book with the spine half torn. He never made a show of it, never asked for more than she could give. But he was there. She laughed for the first time in weeks the day he tripped over a stray cat behind the store, scattering a crate of onions in every direction. She'd been rinsing laundry at the pump and turned just in time to see him curse and nearly lose his footing. "You're not as tough as you look," she said, smiling. He grinned back, brushing dirt from his sleeve. "And you're tougher than you think." She stared at him. A moment, really looked. He was tall, sun-creased, the kind of man who looked like he belonged to the land. But there was something else behind his eyes. Kindness, yes, but sharpened by grief, by experience. He saw everything she realized, and he judged nothing. That evening they sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the grain silos, washing the sky in honey. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was ease, familiar. "Why are you still here?" she asked, not unkindly. Yates leaned on the porch rail, arms resting. Because I want to be. She lowered her eyes to her hands. You don't even know me. He reached out gently, just brushing her fingers. I know enough. She didn't pull away. Something like steady. From that night forward, he held her hand whenever she let him. And she never collapsed again, not the way she had at Red Rock Station. But when she stumbled, when memory came back sharp or breath caught in her chest, he was already there. High summer came early that year, folding itself over the valley like a blanket too heavy to shake off. Dust clung to every hem, every collar. The scent of hay drifted westward, mingling with the slow hum of crickets. The town moved in a hush. Long days' soft light and time stretched like taffy. Calla began walking before dawn when the world was still cool, and the river carried the night's quiet with it. She'd taken to the back trails by the creek cottonwoods rustling overhead, stones clicking beneath her borrowed boots. She carried bread and cheese in a satchel, sometimes a book, and would sit by the bend where the deer drank, letting the silence do what it did best, heal. She found him there one morning, crouched beside the creek with a knife in his hand, coaxing a splinter from his palm. He didn't startle when she spoke. You always this early? He looked up calm. Only when the cattle don't need chasing. She sat nearby on a flat stone. You working less? No, just earlier. Gives me time to think. She folded her hands in her lap. About what Yates flicked the splinter into the water. What comes next? She stared at the ripples, quiet. I haven't let myself think that far. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his pants. Then let me ask you plain. You still planning to keep running? Calla. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she traced a line in the dirt with her boot. I don't want to, she said at last. But I don't know what staying looks like. Yates sat beside her, close enough to feel the weight of the choice. It could look like a job at the school. Miss Cartwright's been short a hand. She mentioned it. Calla blinked. She doesn't know me. She knows what you've done since you got here. I don't know anything about teaching. You know how to listen. That's more than most. She pulled her knees up, resting her chin on them. What if I can't get my children back? He didn't answer quickly. Just looked at her. I don't know, he said. But I know you'll never stop trying. A ribbon on a chair. She went to see Miss Cartwright that same afternoon. Her shoulders were straighter as she walked the path to the schoolhouse, her hair pinned back, hands clasped tight to still the tremble. The children were wary at first, quiet, wide-eyed. Some watched her with suspicion, others with the open curiosity only the very young still dared to carry. Calla didn't press them. She didn't coo or coddle. She simply waited, listened. Knelt when they spoke and let silence make room for trust. By the second day, one of the girls, small sandy-haired, left a ribbon on Calla's chair. Faded blue, soft with use. That evening, while they shelled peas in the alley behind the livery, she mentioned it. I used to braid Willa's hair with ribbons like that, she said, her voice light but fragile. Yates didn't reply. He simply passed her another handful of pods. She cracked one open, then added quieter, I wrote the court in Kansas City. Used a name they wouldn't recognize. He paused, eyes flicking toward her. You think they'll respond? I don't know, she admitted. But if I don't ask, they'll never know I'm still fighting. Yates reached into the basket beside them, fingers moving in rhythm with hers. You ever think about what you'd do if you did get them back? She looked up, eyes catching the first stars. I'd find a place with trees, something near water. Nothing big, just somewhere they could run and not be afraid. He studied her face, that vision flickering there like firelight. Then he said, I know a place like that. She turned to him. Why are you telling me this? He set down a shell and looked her straight in the eye. Because I've been thinking about what comes next too. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the beginning of something neither of them dared name. Not yet. The decision to return. It was late July when the letter arrived. Edges soft from the postman's satchel, the ink smudged slightly from heat. Calla found Yates behind the blacksmith's yard, stripping rust from a broken gate hinge with a file. He looked up when she spoke, her voice steady as gravel packed in a storm-washed road. I got a letter. He didn't ask from where. He wiped his brow and waited. They forwarded my petition to the county clerk, she said. If I want any claim considered, I have to appear in person. Yates set down the file. When 2 weeks, she stepped forward, eyeing the hinge. You fixing that for Heron wasn't going to wait on him to do it. She crouched beside him, picked up the cloth from the dust, and began sanding the second hinge without being asked. They worked in silence for a moment, the metal warm under their hands, dust curling between their knees. I'll need someone to ride with me, she said finally. He didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked to her hands, stronger now, skin healed, but shadows of bruises still lived beneath the surface, like echoes. You sure you want to walk back into that place? He asked. I don't want to, she said, glancing at him, but I can't leave them in his house. Not now that I'm stronger. He shifted, folding his legs to sit beside her fully, their knees nearly touching. Then I'll come. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Mapping the past. The next morning she borrowed a ledger from the schoolhouse and began copying down what she remembered names from the custody hearing court terms. Procedures, phrases that had once felt like barriers, but now tasted like challenge. She didn't ask Yates to help her. Not directly, but when her eyes grew tired from the small print, he slid a rolled map toward her without speaking. This is the county line, he said, tapping a thick black line. And this is where your husband's land sits if it hasn't changed. She traced the ink with one finger. You've been there, drove cattle through. Years back. Big white house. 2 gables. Fence line was new then. Her jaw tightened. That would be it. He watched her a beat longer. Then quietly, you'll need a place to stay once we get there. I won't let you sleep under his roof. She looked up. You already planned this. I don't like leaving things to chance. She closed the ledger slowly, thoughtfully. You always that way. I've seen what happens when people aren't. The next week passed in a blur. She worked mornings at the schoolhouse, afternoons writing letters, one to Miss Cartwright, who offered a character statement, another to Dr. Keller, who promised to vouch for her medical recovery. Every night before sleep she reread her notes, preparing herself not just for court, but for war. And Yates. He showed up with rope and tools and trail gear, never asking why, never asking if she was sure. Only acting like he already knew. The night before departure. The evening before they were set to leave, Calla sat on the porch of the feed store, her boots dusty and skirt damp from the pump out back. The town was quiet, only the groan of a grain wagon and the creak of a weathered sign stirring the air. You ever think, she asked, voice low, how strange it is that you found me at all? Yates leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, hat tilted back just enough to show the lines beside his eyes. "I think about it more than I say." She looked toward the street. "If you hadn't been there—" "I was," he said, cutting her off gently. "That's what matters." She nodded slowly, then hesitated. "I don't know what to do once I have them. I don't have land, or even a horse of my own. You'll have what you need." She met his eyes, hesitant. "I can't ask you to carry all this." "You didn't ask," he said, pushing off the post. "You just handed me half of it without realizing." He walked toward the stables. She followed without a word. Inside, the air was cool with leather and hay. His mare was already saddled, and beside her stood a smaller gelding, brushed, saddled, and quiet. "That's not mine," she said. "It is now." Yates adjusted the reins. "Figured you'd want to ride your own horse." She didn't speak, her throat too tight, her chest too full. "We leave at first light," he added. She placed one hand on the gelding's shoulder, fingers curling into the warm fur, and stood there for a long moment in the stillness, not speaking. That night, the wind pushed at her shutters. Voices drifted from the saloon like ghosts she no longer feared, and in the dark, she lay wide-eyed, thinking not of the court or her past, but of Willa's small hand in hers, of Weston's laugh when he tripped over his boots, and of the man in the stable who hadn't saved her life exactly, but had helped her begin it again. Eastbound, riding toward Reckoning. She was already saddled when Yates rode up just past dawn. Pale light crept up the horizon, painting the sky in silver and soft bruise. The town of Red Rock lay still behind them, windows shuttered, dogs not yet stirring. "You ready?" he asked. Calla didn't speak. She mounted in one fluid motion, tugged her hat down low, and nudged her gelding forward. Yates fell in beside her. They rode east. The sun rose slow behind them, casting their shadows long and lean across the prairie. The road unrolled in dust and wind, the kind that clung to skin like memory. They passed through low country brush and brittle grass, and as the hills fell away, the silence stretched wide around them. By the second day, the land grew flatter, emptier, the kind of emptiness that made you feel the bones in her chest. Calla's thighs ached from the saddle, but she said nothing. She gritted her teeth, eyes ahead. Yates matched her pace, not pushing, not slowing, letting her set the rhythm. They camped that night near a dry ravine. The fire was small, its light flickering across their faces. Yates handed her a tin plate. Calla tore at a biscuit with her fingers, the steam rising soft between them. "I thought I'd feel more afraid," she said. He looked up. "Why don't you?" Her eyes stayed on the fire. "Because I'm not alone this time." He nodded, once silent. The fire crackled. The stars blinked into being. And something between them shifted, not loud, not sudden. Just a thread pulled tighter between two people who no longer needed to explain why they stayed. What stays? What leaves? On the third day they crested a hill at dusk and looked down over a stretch of cottonwoods cutting through the horizon like a scar. They followed the trail until night, bedding down beside a shallow creek. The cold settled early, and Calla curled beneath a blanket while Yates stirred the coals to life again. "You ever think about leaving Montana?" she asked from the shadows. He didn't answer right away. "I did once," he said finally. "After my father died. Thought I'd go south. See San Antonio, maybe." She turned toward him. "But I couldn't leave Ma to run the place. And then the herd grew. The land got into my bones. He tossed a twig into the flames. She moved north last spring. Said she was tired of watching the same sun rise over the same hills. Calla drew her knees in close arms around them. I never had a place like that. Just rooms I passed through. Never mine. Never stayed long enough. Yates looked at her across the fire. You'll have one. She met his gaze. You mean that I wouldn't say it if I didn't? A breeze passed low through the canyon grass, carrying the scent of ash and something faintly sweet. She reached into her saddlebag, fingers fumbling for a folded cloth. Without a word, she passed it to him. He opened it slowly. Inside a ribbon, once pink, now faded to the color of old rose petals. She wore that the day I lost them, Calla said. Willa. She dropped it in the wagon. I didn't know I'd kept it. Yates didn't speak. He just folded the ribbon again, slow and sure, and handed it back. You'll put it in her hair again, he said. Calla tucked it away like something sacred and lay back beneath the stars, her eyes open to the sky. Kansas City. The first step, they reached Kansas City 2 days later, just as the clouds gathered, low and heavy. The city sprawled in noise and motion, carts creaking wheels, splashing through summer mud steam, whistling from engines like pressure rising in her ribs. Calla kept her hat low and coat buttoned. She walked beside Yates with her back straight shoulders, squared her stride, clipped but unbroken. She never reached for his arm, but he stayed close, always within reach. The boarding house was 2 stories of weather-worn paint and thin curtains. The landlady gave them a room with twin cots and a cracked wash basin, but asked no questions. Calla stood at the window after the door closed, watching a boy drive a mule cart down the alley. The courthouse is 4 blocks from here, she said. He didn't interrupt. We'll go first thing. She turned to him, brows drawn. I don't want you in the room. Not unless they ask. Yates nodded. I'll wait outside. She paused. It's not because I don't want you there. I know. Then why aren't you arguing? Because you already decided. A breath escaped her lips. Not a laugh, but close. She sat on the edge of the cot, her fingers picking at the hem of her skirt. It's strange, she murmured. I thought if I ever came back here, I'd feel like I was drowning. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You already did the hardest part. She looked up at him. What's that, living through it? She didn't sleep much that night, but she rose before the sun pinned her hair back tight, and when the courthouse doors opened, she walked through them alone. Not because she had to, but because she could. Testimony and ties. She emerged just before noon, blinking into the high sun like someone coming back from a long tunnel. Her boots clacked steady down the courthouse steps. Her hands were still her shoulders squared, but her face was unreadable. Yates stood as she approached, didn't speak. Just watched her the way he had from that chair by her bed in Red Rock. Ready, but waiting. They agreed to reopen the petition, she said. I have to prove I can support them, show I have a home, an income, stability. He nodded already, knowing where this was going. She held out a folded slip of paper. I need a signed affidavit from the person I live with. Someone who can speak to my character and my work. Yates didn't even blink. Then I'll give it. Her lips parted slightly. It'll mean tying your name to mine. In writing. I don't care about names, he said. She looked down at the paper again. This isn't a favor. I know. They'll send someone to verify it. I've got a month. Yates met her gaze full on. Then we'd best be home before fall. Her fingers closed around the page tighter than before. Home, she repeated, almost like she was testing the sound of it on her tongue. He didn't move to touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. That place I told you about, the one near the stream. It needs someone who knows how to start again. She looked at him with something close to a smile. Not wide, not easy, but real. Maybe that someone's me. The ride west, what's been given. They didn't linger. Within 2 days they were saddling up at the edge of the rail yard, dust curling around their boots. Calla turned to Yates as they tightened their straps, her voice low but sure. I want them to grow up knowing what it means to be safe, to be loved, without condition. Yates met her eyes. Then let's build them a life where that's all they'll ever know. She nodded, once then mounted. This time she didn't look back. Not out of fear, but because everything that mattered was already riding beside her. The return to Montana passed quiet, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, a kind of stillness born of decision. The space between them no longer held old ghosts. It held plans unsaid, but shared. When they crested the ridge that overlooked the valley west of Red Rock, Calla slowed her gelding. Below lay a parcel of land tucked among cottonwoods and creek bed. The old Rourke cabin leaned slightly to one side, tin roof dappled with rust, but the porch still stood. This it, she asked, her voice barely above the wind. Yates nodded. Roof leaks in 2 places. Fence is soft along the north edge. She turned to him. Are we borrowing it or buying it? It's yours, he said. Deed was transferred last week. Put in your name. She blinked. Why, because you can't build something real standing on someone else's land. Her hands tightened on the reins. Yates. That's not I know, he said gently. It's more than you asked for, but not more than you deserve. She looked away quickly, but her shoulders dropped just a little. And when she turned back to face the cabin, she whispered, I don't know how to repay something like that. You don't, he said. You just live in it. Putting down roots. The weeks that followed were stitched together by effort. Honest, sweat-streaked, quietly joyful work. Calla scrubbed the porch boards with her sleeves rolled up, hands raw and damp. Yates patched the roof, replaced the hinge on the barn door. Miss Cartwright sent over a cast-iron stove. Dr. Keller arrived one morning with a parcel of dried herbs and a quilt his sister had left behind. In the evenings they sat on the porch steps with chipped mugs of Corey between them. Some nights they spoke. Other nights the quiet was enough. He always handed her the cup warm. She always passed it back with her fingers brushing his. Just before the first frost, a letter arrived. Calla stood beneath the porch eaves, thumb pressed to the seal. Yates stepped down from the ladder, wiping his hands. From Kansas, he asked. She nodded, then opened it. Her eyes scanned the page, brows furrowed, then lifted. Her mouth set in a line that softened with each word. The court ruled in my favor, she said quietly. They're sending the children with a matron. They'll arrive next week. Yates didn't ask if she was ready. He just said, we'll ride to meet them. Reunion on the platform. The train pulled in under a sky heavy with low clouds, gray and close like an unspoken thought. The whistle cut through the valley sharp and final, as if signaling the end of one chapter and the start of another. Calla stood rigid beside Yates, her gloves clutched in one hand, the other pressed tight to her ribs as if holding something fragile in place. The door opened. A woman in a plain traveling coat stepped down. First a matron, maybe in her 50s, with calm hands and a hard mouth. She guided 2 children forward. The girl Willa looked smaller than Calla remembered. Her dark hair had been chopped unevenly, a patch sewn into a dress. Weston the younger clung to the matron's skirts, his cheeks hollow, his eyes wide and watchful. Calla didn't move. Her breath had caught somewhere high in her chest. She couldn't lift a hand, couldn't speak. But then Willa looked up, just looked, and something shattered in the space between them. "Ma," she whispered. The gloves fell from Calla's hand. Her knees hit the platform as her arms opened wide. Willa ran first, a sob breaking loose as she collided with her mother's chest. Weston stumbled after her, nearly tripping in his haste, burying his face against Calla's shawl. She held them both. She held them like the world had narrowed down to these 2 small breathing bodies. One hand tangled in Willa's hair. The other cradled Weston's head, murmuring again and again, "I'm here. I'm here. I'm here." The matron stepped back and nodded to Yates, who tipped his hat in quiet thanks. They rode home in a borrowed wagon. Willa curled against Calla's side, her thumb hooked in her mother's belt. Weston dozed in her lap, one hand twisted in her shawl. Yates drove steady, glancing back only once to see Calla's eyes close to her cheek, resting against her daughter's head. She wasn't dreaming. Not anymore. A place called home. The cabin was waiting, lamplight glowing from the window, the stove already lit. When they arrived, Yates climbed down first and gently lifted Weston, still half asleep, from Calla's arms. She followed, guiding Willa up the steps, one hand on her daughter's shoulder. Inside, she showed them the bed, small but warm, with a quilt folded at the foot and a wooden box for toys beneath. She pointed out the stove, the corner where sunlight pooled in the morning, the table with space enough for 3. That night, she tucked them in. She kissed their foreheads with a hand that no longer shook. Willa clutched her pillow. Weston snored softly, and for the first time since the bruises, since the hunger, since the train out of hell, Calla stood still in a room filled with peace. She stepped onto the porch afterward, breath visible in the cool night air. Yates was there, leaning against the rail arms, folded loose eyes on the stars. "I don't know how to name what you've given me," she said. He didn't turn right away. When he did, the lantern light caught the creases beside his mouth. "Don't name it," he said. "Just live it." She reached for his hand. "I want you to stay." His voice dropped. "I was hoping you'd say that." She leaned in, resting her forehead to his. "I don't just want a roof, or a field, or a fence that holds. I want something that doesn't vanish when the hard seasons come." His thumb brushed along her cheekbone. "Then that's what we'll build." They didn't kiss right away. They simply stood close, breathing still. And when her lips finally found his, it was quiet, steady, lasting. First snow, first morning. The first snow came gentle like a secret. Overnight, it blanketed the hills in white hush, turning the valley into a watercolor painting come to life. The creek had begun to crust with ice, and the cottonwoods stood bare, their limbs thin and sharp against the silver morning. Willa stood barefoot on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, her small frame silhouetted by the rising sun. She watched the golden light spread across the ridge, her breath fogging the air. Behind her, Calla stepped out, arms wrapping around the girl's shoulders, chin resting on her head. Together they stood as the light climbed higher, brushing the cabin in warmth. Inside, the hearth crackled. Yates stirred the fire while Weston half dozed in his lap, one tiny hand curled in his shirt. The cabin smelled of cedar and ash, and something sweet bubbling on the stove. Calla turned, looked once at the land, their land. Not borrowed, not promised. Simply theirs. She stepped back inside. Into the warmth. Into the life they'd built from ash bruises and quiet hope. What comes after? In the weeks that followed, life didn't explode into happiness. It unfolded soft as snow melt, steady as fence posts driven into thawed earth. There were tantrums from Weston and nightmares that pulled Willa from her bed. Calla would wake to find her daughter at the edge of the room, silent eyes wide. She'd pull her close without question, and the two of them would sit by the stove until dawn, with Yates half awake beside them, rubbing his eyes, never asking for more than he was offered. The children grew into the space like roots testing new ground. Willa began to leave ribbon scraps for her mother, again tied to doorknobs or laid across folded shirts. Weston followed Yates around the yard, asking about horses' tools, the difference between nails and screws. When Yates lifted him onto the saddle for the first time, the boy's grin cracked open, something in all of them. Calla worked the soil by the creek, her hands in earth that felt nothing like the dirt of her past. She planted beans, wildflowers, and sunroots, not because she needed to, but because something in her needed to watch things grow. Sometimes at dusk the four of them would sit on the porch steps in a line quiet close. Willa would lean into her mother's arm. Weston would crawl into Yates' lap and pretend not to fall asleep. The air would be full of crickets, wood smoke, and the sound of breath, that quiet proof that they were still here. One night after the children were in bed, Calla stepped outside to find Yates oiling the saddle under the stars. She watched him a moment, his slow, practiced hand, the calm of a man who never rushed what mattered. He looked up. "You thinking again?" he asked. She smiled, just a little. "I'm always thinking. About what comes next." She nodded. About what it means to stay, to choose it. And she walked to him, set a hand on his shoulder. "It's not just the children. It's not just the house. It's not just safety." He didn't interrupt. "It's that I don't feel like I'm surviving anymore," she said. "I feel like I'm becoming someone new." He stood slow, then touched her cheek. "You're not someone new, Calla. You're just finally standing in your own name." She leaned her forehead to his. "Then, don't let me fall. I won't." And she didn't. Not ever again. Because healing didn't come all at once. It came in mornings full of quiet laughter. In fence wire pulled tight. In the first bloom of wild iris at the edge of the pasture. In the way her daughter fell asleep without crying. In the way Yates never let go of her hand, not even when she stopped needing him to. The past had taken much, but it hadn't taken everything. Some things Calla had reclaimed, and the rest she built herself, day by day, step by step. In a valley of dust and wind beneath the cottonwoods and the slow, steady sun, Calla Zane finally became her own kind of legend.